proceedings. A couple of questions. So I was interested that this painting exhibition is kind of largely associated with artists, I think, that are representational to my mind anyway. I've seen your work before, and it always seems to me to have very strong representational elements to them. And I was just wondering how the text kind of relates to this, to your kind of concerns generally. It's this wonderful text that goes alongside this exhibition that I'm really interested, found fascinating. And it was to do with that notion of the in-between and what that meant to your... Really. Has anybody got any thoughts on what we're talking about when we mean in-between? Anybody want to start with that one?
Well, the original idea and concept for the exhibition was born about a year and a half ago from a conversation that me and Marco had at the Paint North exhibition, and we were trying to figure out why we were still making representational work when we so obviously had formalist concerns and were straddling sort of two camps of painting comfortably. And so the whole thing sort of came from that very brief conversation. Marco suggested, I asked Marco why it was we were still making representation painting, and Marco suggested that it's possibly so that it didn't become pattern making. And I took that statement to Tom, and Tom suggested that there must be more to it than that. And so that's sort of where this conversation started and this exhibition started, with the thinking about what more, if it isn't just to refrain from pattern making, what is it about representation that's making us go back to it? I think it was that sort of started the essay.
Yeah, it was a really brief conversation.
It was very
brief. So I think we're thinking also about why particularly use a medium like painting, which is such a... You'd think by now perhaps it should be exhausted. Everything's been done surely, and we've had photography for ages and what have you. And yet we've got lots of individual practices that still seem to straddle this creating some kind of figurative element, and yet pushing it to the limit of what that figurative means, and where paint stops holding the figure, whatever that figure is, or whatever image.
I suppose what I did with what Richard and Marco talked about there is think how I could think about abstraction slightly aside from formalism in some way. So two of the things I'm interested in this text, well, first is the idea of perception, what it is to behold a painting from a maker's perspective and from a spectator's perspective, to how can you be with a painting in some sense, but also thinking about art historical narratives and how important or not they might be. When you think about what abstraction means, so you think about abstraction, representation, figuration, how do these things attain kind of meaningfulness? They have quite particular moments within art history that makes claims for them being one thing or another. But largely when you behold a painting, you are not necessarily dealing with that particular narrative. So I was trying to provide maybe a dual account of what abstract painting might be. One, through trying to understand my role as a painter making paintings, and another to try and sort of unpack what perceiving a painting is, which delves into semiotics, phenomenology, and other stuff that Adam might talk about in due course. So I suppose I didn't want to deal with the paintings directly in the essay. I didn't want it to be something that was an account of Marco's work, Richard's work, from my perspective. I almost wanted to float an idea about how how we might deal with abstraction now above the particular painters in the show. I mean, I was one of them, so I didn't want to deal with my own work too in those terms.
Yeah, I think it threw up lots of really interesting questions about that kind of binary sort of abstraction and representation, and it got me thinking about, well, is everything really an abstraction? And I just wondered.
Or is everything a representation?
Yeah, I think we just started to have that conversation earlier.
I think part of the research that it caused me to look into whilst planning this was, I've spoken to you about this before, but was the Simon Bill essay, which kind of addresses that, where he points out that our eyes are so bad at interpreting what we see that our brain has to do an incredible amount of work to process that into some kind of thing that we recognise. And it was new to me that we see in a very abstract way anyway. There are parts of your brain that process blue squares, there are parts of your brain that process red lines, and your brain puts all that together, which really did sort of push me to start thinking that there is no real distinction between abstraction and representation at all, and everything is just abstraction.
Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm just sort of thinking that that's a really interesting point, Richard, but I'm sort of coming back to it the other way, in that from a painter's point of perspective, when I'm making something that seems very abstract, it just feels like a thing that's becoming something, so it's at that point. And I think that's taking a very different view to the idea of abstract art with a capital A. And I think we're maybe a little bit too, still a little bit too attached to those notions of abstraction and representation, which is what this is about, questioning, but the idea that there is this one thing or the other. But I don't think that's about looking at figurative painting and saying, well, that looks pretty abstract. I mean, it can be, and if abstraction is probably more of our DNA, coming through art school and all the rest of it. But I think when you're making abstract painting, whatever claims you make for it, it's always in the process of becoming something, and it's the degree to which it's becoming something. Like doing that very, very little, kind of embryonic, and never move beyond it. But it's kind of got the potential to start to become a thing, or to point to a thing, point to something in the world.
And that's an interesting thing about that idea of pointing to something in the world, like a sign or something that is directing us through our prior knowledge to recognise it. I'm thinking about, how maybe, I don't know whether, I'm sure you must all experience this as you see something you can't quite make out what it is. Maybe as you move closer you start to see and recognise it, and it comes into something else kicks in. It's not just what we're seeing, we're also adding in all of that other stuff, our experiences and knowledge, that's kind of bringing the whole thing together for understanding. Yeah.
And that's about naming, isn't it? That's about that point at which you can say that is that thing.
Yeah.
I think there are points when you're looking at the painting, when you're trying to figure out, you're trying to find your way across the painting and understand what you're looking at. I had a funny experience when I was looking online at some of the images for this show. I saw the painting of mine next door, and I didn't recognise it at first. I thought, what's that? And I suddenly saw it in a different way. It looked like a cloud of smoke, and I thought, oh yeah, it's my painting. I had to sort of pinch myself, and then I worked out that I was fooled slightly, and I suppose in a way that whole ambiguity in terms of what you can see and what you can't see, and how you interpret things visually, is what's kind of interested in me in terms of the show. And when Richard offered the opportunity to exhibit, I had in mind certain paintings that I felt was sort of playing around with that idea of ambiguity and abstraction into figuration, that sort of thing that was going on. Yeah.
And then so something is happening as a relationship is there a different relationship with somebody, the viewer, with a work like that, to one where maybe the image is much clearer in terms of its signification to something else?
Yeah.
Is there a different kind of action
So
happening?
you might have to just.
I suppose, well, there's a different relationship perhaps because you're having to bring more to it perhaps than
Yeah.
something where it's a much
Yes.
clearer
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
connection to something.
Yeah. I think the relationship can be different there. And I think in the show, just there's big differences in terms of how things have been handled around that.
Yeah.
But I'll not go into that.
There's also something interesting that happens there because in some of the work we see image more, and then in others, I think particularly yours, I see gesture and surface more.
Yeah.
And there's that kind of